Midnight. Oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor. 002. Today, to help boost water quality. And 004. Help our fish and anglers. The shells. 008. Act as a natural filter to get toxins. 010. Out of the ecosystem. 011. Florida dumped 500,000 tons of. 013. Oyster shells offshore. And what formed? 016. Next left scientists scrambling music. 018. For answers. These weren't shells guided. 020. By precision or a sophisticated plan. 023. They were leftovers discarded, scraped. 026. Off plates and shoveled out of seafood. 028. Plants loaded onto barges and tipped. 031. Into the Gulf of Mexico between 2007 and 034. 2024, nobody expected anything. 037. Remarkable. Critics called it reckless. 039. Ocean dumping. Fishermen feared it would. 042. Destroy what little remained of. 043. Florida's struggling coastal ecosystems. 046. Even the scientists directly behind the 048 program braced for failure. But 050. Something happened on that Gulf seafloor. 052. That violated every expectation. Every. 055. Timeline and every assumption about how. 058. Nature works. A dead stretch of ocean. 1 o'clock. Bottom began transforming into something. 102. Alive, faster, denser, and more complex. 106. Than anything the data predicted. What? 108. Formed down, there wasn't just a reef. It. 110. Was something still expanding today. And 112. Exactly how it happened will change the 114. Way you think about the ocean. 117. The ocean experiment nobody believed. 120. Would work. Between 2007 and 2024. The 125. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation. 127. Commission ran one of the most. 128. Controversial coastal experiments in. 130. State history. The premise was almost. 133. Absurdly simple. Collect discarded. 135. Oyster shells from restaurants and 137. Seafood processing plants across. 139. Florida. Truck them to the coast. Load. 141. Them onto barges and dump them into the 143. Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key. Over. 146. 500,000 tons of them. 148. We're dying. The water quality in. 150. General is dying from 1,000 little. 151. Cuts and then we have one big gash in. 153. The middle with the discharges going on. 155. The opposition was immediate and fierce. 158. Environmental groups called it ocean. 2 o'clock. Dumping disguised as conservation. They. 202. Warned the shells would smother whatever. 204. Fragile life remained on the soft sandy. 206. Bottom. Local fishermen who had spent. 209. Generations working those waters feared. 211. Sediment burial, disrupted currents, and 214. Permanent destruction of fishing grounds. 215. Their families had relied on for a 217. Century. The criticism wasn't fringe. It. 220. Was loud, credible, and backed by real. 222. Ecological concern. And yet, the 225. Commission pressed on. Their logic was 227. Stark. These shells were going to 229. Landfills anyway, if there was any. 231. Chance they could function as reef. 232. Substrate, the experiment was worth. 234. Running. Here's the catch. Nobody. 237. Including the scientists who designed. 238. The program actually expected it to. 240. Work this fast. When the first 242 monitoring teams returned to the 244 deposition sites 18 months after the 246 initial shell drops, they were braced. 248 for the worst. What they found instead. 250 made Dr. KSKY a shellfish habitat. 253 specialist with the Florida Fish Music. 255 and Wildlife Conservation Commission. 257 stop mid-sentence during a team debrief. 3 o'clock. Life was colonizing the shell mounds. 302 not in 2 or 3 years. The standard. 304 timeline for any artificial reef. 306 project. In months, clusters of marine. 309 organisms were forming at rates that had. 311 no precedent in the scientific. 313 literature. The shells weren't acting as. 315 passive debris. They were functioning as. 317 biological triggers. And nobody could. 320 fully explain the speed of what was. 322 unfolding. But here's what nobody. 323 expected to understand why it was. 325 happening so fast you had to look at. 328 something so small it was effectively. 330 invisible. And what was happening down. 332 there was stranger than anyone had. 334 imagined. 336 the invisible phase, microlife that. 339 rebuilt an ecosystem. 341 the pioneers weren't fish. They weren't. 344 oysters. They were bacteria. Within days. 347 of the shells hitting the seafloor. 349 microscopic bacteria began colonizing. 351 the calcium carbonate surfaces forming. 354 thin biofilms structured living carpets. 357 that transformed dead shell into. 359 functional microhabitat. These weren't. 401 random bacterial patches. They were. 403 organized biological infrastructure. 406 laying the groundwork for everything. 407 that would follow. And get this, the 409 shells were doing their own chemistry. 412 oyster shells are composed primarily of. 414 aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate. 417 that dissolves slowly in seawater. As. 419 those shells released calcium ions. They. 422 created tiny alkaline micro ones in the. 424 surrounding water. Those localized. 426 chemical shifts were exactly what. 428 calcifying organisms, barnacles. 431 tubor. MS juvenile oysters needed to. 433 attach and grow. The shells weren't just. 436 providing physical surface. They were. 438 manufacturing the conditions for their. 440 own colonization. Weeks later datums. 443 and microalgae moved into the biofilms. 445 creating the base of a rudimentary food. 448 web microscopic crustaceans and larval. 450 mollusks followed. Those grazers drew. 453 the first juvenile fish. Each stage fed. 456 the next a self-reinforcing loop. 458 building itself invisibly out of. 501 music discarded seafood scraps. Here's. 503 what that means. Sandy seabeds cannot do. 507 this. Sand offers no attachment surface. 509 no chemical microzones, no structural. 512 complexity. The soft bottom gulf floor. 515 was biologically trapped. The shells. 517 bypassed that trap entirely. By the end. 520 of the first 6 months, shell surfaces. 522 were coated in layered biofilm, and 524 microalgae. To a casual observer, the 5:27. Site still looked like failure, but Dr. 5:29. Krimsky's water samples and sediment. 5:31. Cores told a different story. Music in. 5:33. Less time than a traditional artificial. 5:35. Reef shows any biological response at. 5:38. All the shell deposits had established. 5:39. Music a complete microscopic. 5:41. Ecosystem. The invisible phase was the. 5:44. Hidden scaffolding. Without the. 5:45. Bacteria. Without the aragonite. 5:47. Chemistry. Without the biofilm feeding. 5:50. The first grazers, there is no reef. 5:53. Just calcium, just sand. The scaffolding. 5:55. Was in place. If this is already blowing. 5:58. Your mind, hit subscribe because what? 6 o'clock. Came next made the scientists question. 6:02. Everything they thought they knew about. 6:04. How reefs are built. 6:06. The return of the reef builders. Oysters. 6:09. Need hard surfaces to survive. That is. 6:12. The fundamental constraint that had been. 6:14. Quietly strangling Florida's Gulf Coast. 6:16. For decades. Oyster larvae, called spat. 6:21. Drift in the current, searching for. 6:22. Substrate. In a healthy reef system. 6:25. That substrate is the accumulated shells. 6:27. Of previous generations. Centuries of. 6:29. Dead oyster layered into a hard, complex. 6:32. Platform, filtering water, preventing. 6:35. Erosion and providing a home for an. 6:37. Estimated 300 different species. But. 6:39. Florida's natural reefs had been gutted. 6:42. Overharvesting, pollution, and coastal. 6:44. Development had dismantled the network. 6:46. That once spanned hundreds of square. 6:48. Miles. By the early 2000s, larvae were. 6:51. Drifting through open water with almost. 6:53. Nowhere to land. No substrate, no. 6:56. Settlement, no new oysters. The cycle. 6:59. Was broken, and the Gulf had no. 7:01. Mechanism to fix it alone. The dumped. 7:03. Shells solved this bottleneck, almost. 7:05. Immediately. Each pile was a. 7:07. Concentrated landing zone positioned. 7:09. Exactly where Gulf currents would carry. 7:11. Drifting spat. Within the first year. 7:14. University of Florida Marine Lab. 7:16. Researcher Dr. Bill Pine documented. 7:18. Juvenile oysters attaching to the. 7:20. Deposited shells in numbers that far. 7:22. Exceeded projections. The larvae were. 7:25. Finding surface, settling, and beginning. 7:27. To grow. By year 2, those juveniles. 7:30. Were reproductive adults. They were. 7:32. Producing larvae of their own. Which. 7:34. Settled on the existing reef and added a. 7:36. Second generation to the structure. 7:38. Human hands had created the initial. 7:40. Conditions. Nature had taken over. 7:42. Completely. Here's the deal. By year. 7:45. 3. Monitoring surveys recorded in. 7:47. Average of 847 oysters per cubic meter. 7:50. Of deposited shells. Nearby soft bottom. 7:54. Areas with no substrate supported. 7:56. Virtually none. The reefs were no longer. 7:58. Confined to the original depositions. 8 o'clock. Footprint either. Oysters were dying. 8:02. Contributing shell and providing. 8:05. Substrate for the next wave. Vertical. 8:07. Growth, horizontal expansion. The reef. 809 was building itself. And then came the 811 moment that changed the entire 813 conversation around the project. Charter. 815. Captain Mike Lenz had been one of the 817 loudest voices against the shell. 819. Deposition program from the beginning. 821. He had testified against it. He had. 823. Warned it would ruin the fishing grounds. 825. His family had worked for 826 generations. In 2013, standing at the 830 rail of his boat over one of the 831 established reef sites, Lent watched a 834 Yub school of redfish holding in the 836 current around a shell mound and said, 838, something he had never planned to say. 840 was wrong. I've never seen fish stack up. 842 like that in 25 years on this water. 845. That reversal wasn't just one man. 847. Changing his mind. It was the moment, the 849 scientific case and the lived experience. 851 of the Gulf Coast finally aligned. And 854. The fish were only the beginning of what? 856. These reefs were about to do. 858. When the fish I'ved everything. 9 o'clock. Changed. Reef fish don't wait for an 9:03 invitation. The moment structural. 9:05. Complexity appears on a featureless. 9:07. Seafloor they find it. Within 2 years. 9:10. Of the reefs establishing themselves. 9:12. Fish surveys near Cedar Key were. 9:14. Returning numbers that made Dr. Pines. 9:16. Team rechecked their methodology. Biomass. 9:19. Around the reef sites had increased by 9:21. More than 340%. 9:23. Compared to control areas. Species. 9:25. Diversity was up 280%. These weren't. 9:28. Fish aggregating from somewhere else. 9:31. They were juveniles surviving in habitat. 9:33. That hadn't previously supported them. 9:35. The reefs were producing life, not. 9:37. Concentrating it, producing it. Redfish. 9:40. Arrived first, tucking into the complex. 9:42. Shell structure to feed and hide from. 9:44. Predators. Sheep's head followed. 9:46. Thriving on the invertebrate communities. 9:48. Coating the hard surfaces. Flounder. 9:51. Worked the edges. Snook appeared in. 9:53. Numbers not seen in those waters in. 9:55. Years. And get this, Mike Lenz wasn't. 9:58. The only captain who reversed his. 9:59. Opposition. Charter operators across. 10:01. Cedar Key began formally requesting new. 10:04. Reef sites near popular fishing grounds. 10:07. From the same commission they had fought. 10:08. Against 6 years earlier. Hotels, bait. 10:11. Shops and waterfront restaurants all. 10:14. Reported measurable revenue increases. 10:16. Tied directly to the marine surge around. 10:18. The reef sites. The ecological cascade. 10:21. Continued upward. Octopuses established. 10:23. Territories in the reef's complex gaps. 10:26. Sea turtles reappeared, foraging on the 10:28. Invertebrate communities. Dolphins were 10:30. Observed hunting systematically at the 10:32. Reef. Edges working the dense fish. 10:35. Concentrations. Every new arrival. 10:37. Reinforced the food web beneath it. The 10:39. System was growing more complex. More. 10:41. Stable and more resilient with each. 10:44. Passing season. What made this? 1045. Ecologically significant, not just. 1048. Impressive, was what the data confirmed. 1050. About the nature of the change. Dr. 1052. Pine's team was careful to distinguish. 1054. Between fish aggregation and fish. 1056. Production. Artificial reefs made. 1058. Music of concrete or sunken ships are. 1101. Notorious for concentrating fish that. 1103. Already exist in music, an area. 1105. Essentially redistributing a fixed. 1107. Population around a new landmark. That. 1109. Can look dramatic in a survey without. 1111. Representing any actual increase in. 1113. Marine life. The Cedar Key reefs were. 1115. Different. Juvenile fish counts animals. 1118. Born in those waters and surviving to. 1120. Maturity, there were the primary driver. 1122. Of the increase. The reefs were. 1124. Producing fish, creating the conditions. 1127. For survival that hadn't existed before. 1130. That distinction mattered enormously for. 1132. How Florida's fisheries managers, music. 1134. Thought about the future of the program. 1136. But fish were only part of the story. 1138. Music, something else was happening too. 1139. The water itself, something nobody had. 1142. Predicted, and that would have. 1143. Consequences reaching far beyond the. 1145. Reef. The billion-gallon cleaning machines. 1149. Beneath the waves. One adult oyster. 1152. Filters between 30 and 50 gallons of. 1154. Seawater every single day, run that. 1157. Number across hundreds of thousands of. 1158. Oysters thrive